Hello everyone, welcome. We're going to be looking at kids' games in the medieval era and into the 17th century. And our objective today is to be able to explain how kids were entertained in the medieval era. Entertainment was quite different in the medieval era as opposed to the modern era. And we've already talked a little bit about the role of electronic entertainment today with video games, phones, and apps. And none of this existed in the medieval and early modern era. So kids had to be entertained in different ways, and today we'll be looking at a few of those in detail. Now, in the medieval era, families were really close. Kids would spend most of their time with their parents because there was no organized childcare. So when mom and dad would go to work, kids would also go to work as well. Now, it didn't mean they were doing jobs in a field or on a farm, but they were spending that time with their parents. And this would translate into the types of entertainment that kids would use as well as adults. And the games that they would play would be friendly towards adults and both children. Now, for most people, life was really difficult. The only kind of work you could do would be manual labor jobs, and most of these were on farms. In the medieval era, we were known as what's called an agrarian society, and everything was sustained by farm production. Now, to be able to harvest on a large field, you would need a number of people working as farmers. As time would go on, technology would replace farmhands. And today, about 1% of our population would be classified as farmers, when in the medieval era, it was about 75 to 80% of the population was classified as being a farmer. Working days would be about 14 hours, which left very little time and very little disposable income for entertaining. This is Bruegel's children's game painting made in 1560. We're going to be alluding to this on a few occasions during our lesson today. There's also a link in the description below to take you to a high quality, high resolution version of this image. And it's encouraged for you to take a quick look at this throughout the video and just see if you can spot any of the games that we're discussing in detail. Now, games for kids, the simpler the game, the better it was. And the best games for kids, especially in the medieval era, didn't require any specialist items or specialist tools, and they could be played with very little setup or very little preparation. Now, many games played by children in the 21st century actually date back to those in the medieval era. And the job for you to do now is just to think to yourself of any games that you enjoyed as a child that were really easy to play and they didn't require any kind of specialist items. So think of a game that you and your friends could start playing rather spontaneously and could stop playing just as quickly. So no specialist tools or no specialist items needed. So the first one that probably came to mind was hide and seek. Hide and seek has its origins in ancient Greece. It's an affordable game, doesn't cost anything, it's really easy to play, and it's quite fun. And the game can be made more challenging based on the area that you're playing it in. So playing hide and seek in the woods is a bit less challenging than, say, playing hide and seek in a field. So here we have a little snapshot from Bruegel's children's games, and we can see down here we have a few kids who are actually playing hide and seek, and this little girl, she's decided to hide behind a mound of dirt. Knuckle bones. This is very similar to the modern version of jacks. The modern version, you have these often made of aluminium. They're little cast aluminium shapes. And you have a bouncy ball, and you bounce the ball off the ground, and you try to pick up as many jacks with your right hand, and then catching the ball before it hits the ground. Whoever picks up the most jacks would win. In the medieval era, knuckle bones was played with the knuckle bones, often from animals that were slaughtered for food. And instead of a bouncy ball, you would throw a rock into the air, pick up as many knuckle bones with your right hand, and catch the rock before it hits the ground. And here again, another picture from Bruegel's children's games, and we can see what looks like a mum and possibly her daughter. They're playing knuckle bones. So we see the knuckle bones on the ground and the rock being thrown in the air. Blind Man's Bluff. It was originally called Blind Man's Buff. Over time, someone added an L in there, but it's a game very similar to tag. There would be someone who's blindfolded, and they're considered to be the one who is it. Uh, so players who are not blindfolded, they try to get as close as possible without being touched by the blinded individual. If you get tagged, then you have to switch. So the person who is tagged gets a blindfold on. The person who is blindfolded, they're free to run around. An object of the game was to see how close you could get without actually getting touched. And here we have some people in Bruegel's children's games. We have the blinded person here, and they're trying to go and touch the others. Cold Hand. This is a variation of Blind Man's Bluff. A player would be blindfolded and surrounded by several other players. I don't quite understand the object of this game, but apparently you would get slapped by somebody who was standing around you, and while you're blindfolded, you have to guess who slapped you. If the slappee guesses the slapper, they would end up trading spaces. Again, in Bruegel's children's games, here we have a bunch of people just smacking someone in the face, but they're clearly playing a game of Cold Hand. Tug-o-war. This has actually changed very little over time. Cruel Sport was really popular in the medieval and early modern era. If you want any more information on Cruel Sport, feel free to visit that video. It can be found in the Leisure playlist or in the Year 7 playlist. Over time, it changed in the way that we don't put hazards in between the two sides. Oftentimes, they would do it over a rose bush, a hedge, a puddle, or a stream. And again, the losing side would then either get wet, dirty, or in the case of a rose bush, potentially quite injured. In Bruegel's children's game, the dividing line is not a hazard, it's just two stones placed on the ground. But the hazard they've introduced is sitting on somebody's back and holding onto someone's belt as an anchor. And I'm assuming that if you get pulled over the line, you're going to take quite a tumble off that person's back onto the ground. Mob football, quite famous and quite well known. There's a horrible histories video about mob football. Feel free to check that out if you wish. There's no limit to players. The goals were often miles apart. A ball would often be an inflated pig's bladder or a bladder stuffed with sawdust, and violence was the name of the game. People in the medieval era did not have very nice lives. They were often quite angry, and an opportunity to take out their aggression on others is something that they would seize. We can see here in Bruegel's children's games, it looks like this person has the inflated pig's bladder. It looks like it might be stuffed with sawdust. And the others have completely forgotten entirely about the game of mob football and are just tackling these two players now. Archery was made compulsory to practice under Henry VIII's An Act Concerning the Shooting of Longbows. The reason why this was compulsory is England was always in threat of being invaded by other countries, so namely France and Spain. And monarchs wanted to make sure that all of their citizens had the ability to be able to use a longbow for defense if required. This didn't mean that the average person was forced to join the army, but they were certainly wanted to be trained up enough that if the day did come when an invasion happened, they'd be able to help in the defense of England. Funny enough, this is still a British law today. It's never been repealed, and the law says that any man over the age of 14 and under the age of 60 must practice his archery for 2 hours weekly, usually on a Sunday. It's not a law that's enforced anymore, but it's just a fun fact that it's the law that still remains. So a quick task for us to do is to have a pause of the video and see if you can spot any of the games that we've talked about throughout our lesson. There's also a link in the description to a high quality, high resolution version of Bruegel's children's game, so either pause this or visit that link and see how many of these different games can you spot that we discussed. Right, now it's time for our bonus facts about kids' games in the medieval era. A really popular game around the holidays was called King of the Bean. Here we have a picture of a medieval feast, and we can see there's loads of families around, and they're celebrating. It might be Christmas or Mother's Night, or possibly even Shrove Tuesday, but we've got plenty of food to go around. And a staple part of the diet in the medieval era was bread and cake. So here we've got our loaf of bread, and King of the Bean meant that a bean was inserted somewhere into the loaf of bread. Sorry, not that kind of bean. It was actually this kind of bean. Inserted somewhere into the loaf of bread, And when the bread was cut up, whoever had the bean in their bit, they would be the winner. There was another archery law from 1403 that said, in York, excluding Sundays, it's perfectly legal to shoot a Scotsman with a bow and an arrow. Now, this law comes from a time when Scotland routinely was sending individuals to invade areas of Durham and York. Now, the same law was also found in Chester, where they substituted Scotsmen for Welshmen because the Welsh were often invading Chester. It's still a law today. It's never been repealed, but it's not legal technically to go and shoot someone with a bow and arrow. But this was a law designed to try to stop the Scots and the Welsh from invading different areas of England. And the last one, peeing was quite fun. Going back to Bruegel's children's games, if you look in the very back, you will see here that there's a child who is peeing. Peeing was a great way to have fun because everybody needs to do it, and you can have contests as who can pee the farthest, who can pee the highest, who can pee the longest, and even who can pee on each other without running away. That concludes our lesson for today. Make sure you go ahead on to Show My Homework and complete your quiz all about children's games in the medieval era.